Hey everyone, welcome to the show. I was prepping for this one and just thinking, just imagine a civilization so advanced, right, that they were building, seriously, building roads through dense, impenetrable forest. Well, everyone else, their neighbors, were like still trying to figure out how to farm basic agriculture.
Yeah,
A people whose artistry is still copied today, like we're still looking to them for inspiration.
absolutely.
And yet there's this push by some to just erase them from history like they never even existed.
It's wild, isn't it? And
Uh,
so we're diving into this book today, A Brief History of the Celts
hmm.
by Peter Beresford Ellis. It's like peeling back layers of forgotten history. Really
Yeah.
fascinating stuff.
It's history, yeah, but it's almost a thriller in a way, right? Like who were these people?
Totally.
So if you're ready to uncover the truth, the real deal about the ancient Celts, hit that like button and subscribe. It helps us out so much.
Yeah, thanks for the support.
Now, Peter Beresford Ellis, he takes us on this journey across Europe and centuries to explore the Celts. And we're not just talking about fierce warriors, though there's that too, but also their innovations in agriculture, medicine, even art.
Way ahead of their time in many ways.
Oh, totally. And you'll find a link to the book on Amazon in the description below. We're going to be, teasing out some of the really interesting parts of their culture today, things that might surprise you, might even challenge everything you thought you knew.
Yeah, hopefully without giving away the entire story. You got to read it yourself.
Of course, of course. Now, you shared this book with us, because you're really interested in understanding who these Celts were beyond the stereotypes, right?
Exactly. The popular image is often so simplified.
Yeah. So our mission today, and we chose to accept it, is to unpack the most important insights from Ellis's work, giving you a clear and hopefully engaging picture of, their impact.
A profound impact, I'd say, on European history.
Okay, so Ellis, he starts off right off the bat with this bold statement. The ancient Celts, he says, have been described as the first Europeans. That's that's setting the bar pretty high, wouldn't you say?
It does, but it highlights just how significant and how early their presence was across the continent. Think about it. By the 3rd century BC, their influence stretched from Ireland, way over in the west, all the way to what's now central Turkey.
Wow.
And they had established communities everywhere from Belgium up north, down through Spain, even into the Po Valley in Italy.
That's a huge chunk of Europe. It wasn't just like little pockets here and there.
No, not at all. And what's fascinating is that this wasn't just about territory. They were mixing and blending, combining their Indo-European traditions with local customs, which created these regional Celtic identities.
So like different flavors of Celt,
Yeah.
but still with a core set of cultural similarities.
Exactly, maintaining those core threads, but with regional variations. Super interesting.
Yeah, it's almost like impossible to imagine that kind of spread back then.
And keep in mind, their settlements went even further. Archaeologists have found evidence of Celtic communities in, get this, southern Poland, Russia, even Ukraine.
Wow.
And there's even this theory, a bit more debated, but still connecting them to the Tocharians.
So who?
The Tocharians. They were an Indo-European group who settled in, get this, the Xinjiang province of China.
China.
Yeah, I know, right? But it makes sense when you think about it. Like the study of languages over such a massive area, India to Europe, it reveals these shared roots. So it hints at this long history of people connecting, migrating, mixing, and being able to identify Celtic languages within this Indo-European family. It helps us trace their origins, see how they relate to other ancient peoples.
Okay, so China's a long way from, Ireland. But when did it all start? When can we actually start talking about the Celts? Like, is there a specific moment?
That's where it gets tricky, and where historians, they have different opinions, because the Celts themselves, they didn't leave us written records, not in their own languages anyway, at least not before the early Greek writings around the 6th century BC.
Oh, okay.
So some historians, they're really cautious about using that term Celts before that point.
They're like, hold on, we need more evidence.
Exactly. But we can use, linguistics, compare Indo-European languages and look at what we find from archaeology, and that helps us build a pretty good picture of their life, especially during that first millennium BC.
So it's kind of like detectives piecing together clues.
Exactly. And think of archaeological cultures like Hallstatt and La Tène. Those are like distinct phases in Celtic history. You can identify them by their art styles, the technology they used, like the adoption of iron and Hallstatt and how they organized their society. And those phases, they help us track how Celtic civilization developed over time.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. One of the things that really, really stood out to me early on in the book is how Ellis, he really pushes back against this image of Celts, just those fierce barbarian raiders.
Oh, absolutely. And he does it right away. While their military skills, they're undeniable, those are well documented, he makes it clear that, there was more to them. He says, and I'm quoting here, warfare was not their only profession. They were basically farmers.
Farmers.
Farmers. And get this, they were really good at it.
Okay.
Even the Romans, who weren't exactly slouches themselves when it came to agriculture. They were actually impressed by the Celts' farming techniques.
Like they had some advanced stuff going on.
Oh, yeah. And it's so important because it shifts our focus, right? It broadens our understanding of their daily life, how their economy worked.
It's not just about war and raiding.
Exactly.
They were also amazing road builders, like serious engineers. Ellis mentions that they, and I'm quoting again, cut the first roads through the previously impenetrable forests of Europe. And and get this, many of the Latin words we use for roads and transport, they come from Celtic languages. That's mind-blowing.
It really shows you their impact, how they shaped the landscape, literally. And their innovation, it didn't stop there. Their medical knowledge was pretty advanced for the time, particularly in surgery.
Yeah.
And their art, their craftsmanship, it's just, as Ellis puts it, breathtaking.
Yeah, he's not holding back on the praise.
Nope. He calls them, and I love this, the most exuberant of the ancient European visual artists.
I can see that. Their metalwork, stone carvings, glass, jewel. It's all so intricate and beautiful.
It really is. And it just adds to this picture of a dynamic, inventive culture, so much more than just, barbarians.
Right, right. But then Ellis throws in this curveball, right? He mentions this mini storm, as he calls it, this debate about whether the ancient Celts even existed.
Yeah. This is really interesting. The public, they mostly became aware of this debate because of an archaeologist, Dr. Simon James, and his book, The Atlantic Celts.
Okay.
And his argument was basically that there's no evidence of people in Britain or Ireland before 1700 AD actually calling themselves Celts.
So no written records, inscriptions, nothing like that.
Pretty much. And he argued that this whole idea of a unified Celtic identity in those islands, it was mainly a product of nationalism that emerged in the 18th century.
Okay.
And he also wasn't convinced about these big migrations from the continent, bringing a distinct Celtic population to Britain and Ireland.
So he's saying essentially they weren't really Celts in the way we think of it today.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And it really shook things up in the academic world. Like Ellis compares it to someone saying, the ancient Greeks never existed.
Whoa, that's a big claim.
Right. And Dr. James, he hoped that his work would spark more research, more collaboration to try and, figure this out.
Find some common ground.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But some archaeologists like Professor Barry Raftery and Professor Barry Cunliffe, they weren't having it. They saw it as Ellis puts it, anti-Celtic revisionism.
Okay.
Their argument, and Ellis agrees with this, is that, look, you can't deny the shared Celtic languages, the religious system, the mythology, the cultural expressions, even the legal structures. All of that existed in Britain and Ireland during the Iron Age. And to them, that means those people were Celts, no question.
So it's maybe they didn't have this centralized political state, and maybe they didn't all use the label Celt in the way we understand it today, but those deep connections, they're hard to ignore.
Exactly.
And that makes me wonder, where did the name Celt even come from? Ellis goes into some interesting possibilities, right?
Yeah, he does. And it's really intriguing because there's no definitive answer. We don't have this clear historical record saying, okay, this is where the name comes from, end of story.
So it's a mystery?
Kind of. Ellis talks about some doubtful etymologies, meaning proposed origins that, well, most linguists don't really buy anymore.
Like what?
Oh, meanings like raised or noble or to strike or even to surround.
Oh, okay.
But none of those have really stuck.
So what's the leading theory?
The one Ellis seems to favor is that the word, it comes from this Indo-European root kel, which means hidden. And what's interesting is this root, it survived in both Old Irish as selim, meaning I hide, and in Old Welsh as selef.
The hidden people. That's a cool concept.
Right. And it ties into this idea that the Celts, they didn't write down their knowledge, at least not their important religious knowledge.
Okay.
Caesar, Julius Caesar, he observed that the Druids, they believed that writing down their religious doctrine, it was forbidden.
Oh.
Although they did use the Greek alphabet for other things, more practical stuff. And even today, in modern Irish, Celt can refer to an act of concealment, and it's also, the word for the kilt, which was traditional design to, well, conceal.
So it's like this thread running through their culture, this value of secrecy, of hidden knowledge.
Exactly. They place a lot of emphasis on oral tradition.
And language is so important for understanding who they were, right?
Yeah.
Ellis says they were distinguished from their fellow Europeans by virtue of the languages which they spoke.
Absolutely. It's what set them apart, what made them unique. Their languages, they formed this independent branch within the huge, vast Indo-European family.
Huge family.
It is, and it's amazing that way back in the 16th century, this Scottish scholar, George Buchanan, he recognized the relationship between the surviving Celtic languages.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty impressive. And by the time we see them in written records, these languages, they had already split into various dialects.
So different regions had their own, like, accents and slang.
Exactly.
Hmm.
But even though they had these regional variations, the speakers, they still share these common links. You can see it in their social structures, their religious beliefs, their material culture.
So, like, even though they sounded a bit different, they still understood each other on a deeper level.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And that Indo-European connection, it's like this thread that ties them to this massive web of other cultures and languages across Europe and even, as Ellis points out, as far as India.
Like, we're talking serious distances.
Serious distances, and he uses the word for name as an example. It shows how those common roots, how that shared vocabulary and those fundamental grammatical structures, they point to this shared ancestry.
Like, the building blocks of language are similar.
Exactly. They have this distinction between nouns and verbs, this thing called an inflective structure, where the endings of words tell you their grammatical function, and they use a decimal system of counting. All of that is common across the Indo-European languages.
So we're seeing those echoes of the past, of a shared past, in the words we use today. It's pretty cool when you think about it.
It is. And to make it even more obvious, just compare that to languages that aren't in the Indo-European family, like Basque or Finnish.
Yeah.
Their number systems, their grammar, it's totally different.
It highlights the connection even more.
Absolutely. And Ellis, he even touches on some surviving traces of their mythology.
Like there's stories about the gods and heroes and all that.
Yeah. And it's fascinating because these stories, they're fragmented, right? We only have bits and pieces. But we find these remnants of creation myths in texts like the Liahargapala, which talks about the early arrivals in Ireland around the time of the biblical flood.
Oh, wow.
And there are other flood myths, too, like the Welsh story of Leon and the Adunk. And even though they're different stories, they hint at this shared mythological background.
It's like they're telling the same story, but with different characters and settings.
Exactly. And as we move forward in time, we start to see the Celts emerge more clearly in the writings of the Greeks. Guys like Hecataeus of Miletus and Herodotus.
Okay.
Now, Herodotus, he mentions the Danube River, that big river, and he says it originates among the Celts.
Makes sense.
Right. But then he also says that they lived beyond the Pillars of Hercules. And that's something scholars debate today.
Why is that?
Well, the Pillars of Hercules, that was how the Greeks referred to the Strait of Gibraltar. And Ellis, he suggests that maybe Herodotus just forgot to say also, because Celts were definitely present in southern Spain at that time.
So, like he was saying, they lived there as well as in other places?
Exactly. But regardless, those early Greek mentions, they give us this glimpse, right? This outside perspective on the Celts within that broader historical context.
And then we have archaeology, which pushes their story back even further. You mentioned it earlier, the Bronze Age Tumulus and Urnfield cultures.
Right, and those are often seen as Proto-Celtic.
Proto-Celtic.
Meaning, like, the ancestors, the precursors to the Celts we know from later periods.
Yeah.
And the transition from those cultures to the Hallstatt culture, which archaeologists date to around 1200 BC, it shows a clear connection. It's not like a sudden break.
Okay.
And the Hallstatt culture, it's defined by its use of iron, its distinct geometric art style, those beautiful patterns, and the elaborate graves of high-status individuals. Sometimes they were buried with these four-wheeled wagons.
Fancy.
Yeah, right.
Oh.
And those wagons, they tell us a lot. They suggest advanced technology and probably a pretty good understanding of how to build roads.
Okay.
And then in these Hallstatt graves, We also find trade goods from the Mediterranean. So we know they were connected to that wider world even back then.
Wow, so they were trading with like the Greeks and the Egyptians and all those
It
civilizations?
seems so.
Mm.
And from the Hallstatt period, we move into the Latin culture.
Yeah.
That's probably what most people think of when they hear Celtic art, those intricate swirling designs.
Yeah, I can see that.
And it's during the Latin period that we see these new art styles emerge, along with faster chariots and what seems to be a pretty high standard of living for many people.
Like they were doing all right for themselves.
Yeah, they were just scraping by. They were skilled farmers, both in crops and livestock. And they had impressive engineering skills for irrigation, for building those roads. And they were also, mining, extracting resources like salt and gold.
So they had a diverse economy.
Very much so.
Yeah.
And this period also saw their big expansion across Europe.
Yeah, you mentioned that earlier. It's hard to grasp how far they spread.
It is.
Mm-hmm.
They went from those areas they were already in, Iberia, Ireland, Britain, and they started moving east along the Danube River.
Okay.
They established themselves in what's now the Czech Republic and Slovakia, Bohemia, that region. It actually gets its name from a Celtic tribe, the Boii.
Yeah.
And they kept going into the Balkans, all the way to the Black Sea. There's even evidence that they formed the ruling class of Thrace for a while, and then on to Greece and into Asia Minor, where they established the kingdom of Galatia.
Yeah.
And it's not just about conquering territory. We also find Celtic mercenaries and their families serving in places as far-flung as Syria, Israel, Egypt, even Carthage.
So they were like all over the ancient world.
Pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
And while their early history was largely oral, we do start to find written evidence, even outside of what the Greeks and Romans wrote about them.
Like written by the Celts themselves.
Exactly. And it's fascinating because it gives us this direct window into their world.
Mm-hmm.
For example, there's this poetic dedication to the Celtic horse goddess Epona, found in Rome, in Italy. It dates to the late 1st century BC, and it's written in Latin script.
Okay.
But the language, it's Celtic. And it's just so interesting because it shows how these cultures were interacting, blending. And it also shows that these Celtic deities, they were still important even in a Romanized context.
And what about those Iberian Celtic inscriptions? You mentioned them earlier.
Oh, those are great. They're some of the longest surviving texts we have in Celtic languages. They're mostly from northern Spain. And some of them are votive offerings, like dedications to the god Lugus. And then there's this really long text found at Bodarita in the 1990s. It's Celtiberian, which is a fascinating branch of the Celtic language family.
So we're getting more and more pieces of the puzzle.
We are. And then there are the Gaulish inscriptions, like that appeal to Meponis from Chemelaer.
Aponis.
He was a god of healing. And then there are inscriptions with invocations to other deities, like the one found at Hospitalet du Larzac. And those are so important because they're direct evidence of the Gaulish language and of their religious beliefs.
Okay.
And even Celtic coins, those can tell us a lot. They give us personal names, linguistic insights.
So we're learning from all these different sources.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that the earliest Latin inscriptions, they're about the same age as those early Celtic ones. And before long, we even see this Celtic school of writers emerge in Cisalpine Gaul.
Cisalpine Gaul, that's northern Italy, right?
Yep, that's right. And they were writing in Latin, which was, the common language of the Roman world. But the interesting thing is they were writing about Celtic topics using Celtic sources.
So like preserving their own cultural heritage within the Roman system.
Exactly. But for the most part, the vast majority of their knowledge, it stayed within that oral tradition until Christianity came along.
Yeah.
And that eventually led to Irish becoming one of Europe's oldest literary languages.
Because they started writing down their stories and their laws and all that.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's this really unique script, the Ogham script.
Yeah.
It's a native Irish alphabet, and it's named after Ogma, the god of eloquence.
Okay.
And we find mentions of it in their myths and sagas, but most of the actual inscriptions we have, those date from like the 4th to 6th centuries AD.
Yeah.
And they're carved on stone, mostly in Ireland, but also in parts of Britain.
Okay.
And some of them are even bilingual, Ogham and Latin.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty cool. And most of them are concentrated in southwest Munster in Ireland, which suggests that maybe it was invented by the poets of that region.
So it's like a tangible link to their language, their culture.
Absolutely. And Ellis also talks about these early Irish texts on cosmology,
Yeah.
genealogies, family histories.
Okay.
And what's remarkable is that those texts on cosmology, they confirm some shared worldviews with ancient Vedic writings from India.
Really?
Yeah, and we already had a hint of that from the Kalani calendar that we talked about earlier. But these Irish texts, they solidify that connection.
So it's like their worldview, it stretched across continents.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then those genealogies, those family histories of Irish kings and chieftains, some of them go back as far as 1015 BC. And there's even a collection called the Benchentius, which focuses on the genealogies of prominent women.
Wow.
And that tells us so much about how they view their own history, how important lineage and ancestry were to them.
And when we talk about their social structure, Ellis mentions some rituals like the Bull Festival.
The Tarpais, yeah. It was this ritual with Indo-European roots where a druid would eat a bull and then go into a trance, and they would have a vision of the next king.
They ate a whole bull.
Well, maybe not the whole thing, but it shows how important bulls were in their culture, how much reverence they had for them.
Yeah.
And we see that reflected in their art too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also evidence that some tribes had a system of dual kingship, like two kings ruling together.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? And the concept of kingship, it was tied to ancestry, to lineage, but it wasn't always a straightforward thing, where the eldest son automatically inherits the throne. They often emphasized choosing a strong leader, someone capable. And in Ireland, they had this system called tanistry.
Tanistry.
Yeah, it was a way of choosing the next king while the current king was still alive.
Yeah.
It was meant to prevent disputes and ensure a smooth transition of power. It was. And there are also indications of matrilineal descent in some group, like the Picts. And women, they held important roles. Like we see powerful female rulers like Onomaris, Cardamondua.
Boudica, she was a force to be reckoned with.
She was. And it's not just them. There's also the Vix princess. Her grave was filled with these incredible riches, showing the high status of some women. And even Tacitus, that Roman historian, he quotes Boudica saying, "This is not the first time that the Britons have been led to battle by a woman."
Wow.
Yeah, that's a powerful statement. And even the Brehon laws in Ireland, they acknowledged that women could be rulers of hostages,
Yeah.
and that a female heir called a Banco Marbe could inherit property. So it's clear that women in Celtic society, they weren't just confined to the domestic sphere.
They had agency, they had power.
Exactly.
And speaking of power, those princely burials, they really show us the wealth and the far-reaching connections of the Celtic elite.
Oh, absolutely. The Hallstatt graves, like the one at Vix, with the princess and that massive Greek bronze crater, it's
So
incredible.
it's a time capsule.
It is. And it shows us that they were trading with the Mediterranean world. They had access to luxury goods. And there are other amazing graves, too, like Roald Algesheim, Wetwang Slack, the Rheinheim princess. All of them show the high status, the wealth of these individuals, including women.
Yeah.
And then there are the graves with life-sized statues, like at Hirschlanden, and richly furnished tombs like Kleinesbergel.
Like, they were setting them off in style.
They were. And among those powerful figures, those queens, Cardamondua and Boudica,
Yeah.
they really stand out.
Because they ruled in their own right.
Exactly. Cardamondua, she was the queen of the Brigantes, a powerful tribe in Britain. She made alliances with Rome, but she also faced internal conflict. And she ultimately betrayed Caractacus, the rebel leader, to the Romans. Yeah, it's a complicated story. And then Boudica, she led this massive revolt against Roman rule after she and her daughters were mistreated. And her initial victories, they were devastating for the Romans.
I bet.
But eventually the Romans, they regrouped and defeated her. And Boudica, she died probably by poison. But her story, it's a testament to her strength, her leadership.
A true warrior queen.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can't talk about the Celts without talking about the Druids.
They're wise men, they're priests.
Exactly. And Ellis makes this really interesting comparison between them and the Brahmins in Hindu society.
The Brahmins.
Yeah, they were the priestly class in ancient India. And the comparison, it's insightful because it shows that the Druids, they weren't just, priests in the narrow sense. They were scholars, they were philosophers, they were judges, they were advisors to kings. They had this unique and powerful position in Celtic society. And they had different titles for different types of priests. Like there were the Gutuatri, which means speakers to the gods.
I like that.
Right. And Strabo, that Greek writer, he described them as studying nature, moral philosophy. They were judges, they settled disputes, even arbitrated wars. And they believed in the immortality of the soul, the idea that the universe is indestructible.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty profound stuff. They had a hierarchical structure with one leader at the top. And they were exempt from military service. They didn't have to pay taxes, but their training, it could last for 20 years.
20 years? That's longer than, like, med school.
It is. And they had to memorize all these verses, all this traditional
So it
knowledge.
shows like a serious commitment.
Oh, absolutely. And a central belief for them was the transmigration of the soul after death. They believed that this fostered courage, made people less afraid of dying in battle.
Because their soul would just go on to another life.
Exactly. And they would have these deep discussions about astronomy, cosmology, the nature of the gods. And they were also the keepers of their people's history, their oral traditions. And they were incredibly accurate. Like the fact that Gaulish Druids, they still knew about Rome's defeat in 390 BC, centuries later. That's amazing.
It shows how strong their oral tradition was.
It really does. But their influence, it was eventually seen as a threat by the Romans.
Because they had so much power, so much respect among the people.
Exactly. And Claudius, the Roman emperor, he officially outlawed the Druids in 54 AD.
Wow.
Yeah, it was part of this Roman strategy to suppress Celtic culture, to consolidate their control.
Makes sense from their perspective.
It does. But later on, some Greek scholars, especially those associated with the Alexandrian school, they had a more positive view of the Druids. They drew on earlier Greek sources,
Right.
and they saw them as intellectuals, as philosophers. And Dion Chrysostom, he actually traveled to Galatia and observed the Druids there. And he was really impressed. He compared them to the Brahmins in terms of their knowledge, their influence. And it's interesting because, we also have Irish texts, legal documents, that confirm the Druids' role as the intellectual elite in Ireland.
So it wasn't just the Greeks who saw them that way.
No, not at all. And the transition from Druidism to Christianity in the Celtic lands, it was really interesting.
Oh, so.
Well, many of the early Celtic saints, both men and women, they were either Druids themselves or they came from Druidic families. So it wasn't like this complete break, this rejection of the old ways. It was more like an integration and adaptation.
Like they found a way to blend the two.
Exactly. And the Druids, they were often the ones who were open to this new learning, to Christianity, and they helped shape what we now call the Celtic Church.
So it wasn't just imposed from the outside, it came from within.
Exactly.
Now, when it comes to warfare, we can't ignore that. But Ellis makes it clear that the Celts, they weren't just fierce warriors, they were also really innovative. They came up with new technologies, new tactics.
Absolutely. They're actually credited with inventing chainmail around 300 BC. And the Romans, they adopted it later on.
Chainmail, that's serious armor.
It is. And Plutarch, he even mentions how effective Celtic swords were in battle. And the word gladius, the Roman short sword, it's believed to have Celtic origins.
Really?
Yeah. And they also had these javelins with these nasty serrated edges. And while they didn't rely on archery as much, they did use bows and slings defensively. But their real secret weapon, you could say, was their chariots and their cavalry.
Like those fast-moving, horse-drawn chariots. Expert speaker.